Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and today I think it's perhaps going to be one of the most difficult podcast conversations I've hosted since I've been doing this for over 2 years or almost 3 years now, because it's about the ongoing tragedy unfolding in Palestine since the Hamas terror attacks that killed hundreds of Israeli citizens and the violence that has been unleashed in the region since. It's been emotional, it's been difficult. You kind of don't know what is truth, what isn't, because of the information operations going on social media. So I figured that we have a bit of a nuanced conversation around this topic with my colleague, Tuqa Nusairat, who is director at the Rafik Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council, and somebody who's been following this region and conducting research, programming, analysis of what's going on in the region for a number of years. So I figured that rather than have a sort of unsophisticated conversation on something so complex, I invite Tuqa to have her share a perspective on what's going on. Tuqa's bio is in the description below as well, and I've also linked to some of the pieces run by the council over the last few weeks or the last few days as this tragedy has unfolded. And before I jump in, I think one of the things I would just flag for all of us as listeners to this podcast or people who are engrossed by what's going on is don't forget about our shared humanity. I think there's a lot of people who would rather inflame people's emotions and inflame what we should or should not believe about what's going on. But at the end of the day, if you approach everything from the fact that we're all human beings and we have a shared humanity, it just gets a lot easier to see each other in the best light that is possible. So, with that, Tuqa, thank you so much for taking out the time today in this very difficult moment. And I want to begin this conversation with perhaps you setting the stage for the audience about what happened and why did it happen. Of course, there's an ongoing occupation for decades. Of course, Hamas is viewed as a terror organization and has done a lot of bad things. Of course, there haven't been elections in Gaza since 2006, if I remember. But at the end of the day, as somebody who followed it from a South Asia lens, developments in the region, there were conversations going on in the run up to these terror attacks, in focus on Gaza, but also Saudi Israel, and we'll get to that in a minute. So start by setting the scene for the audience about the backdrop to the Hamas terror attacks, and then we'll get into what is happening now and the implications for things going forward.
Sure. Thank you, Uzair, for having me and for providing this venue to have this kind of discussion, which, as you alluded to, is difficult for anyone working on this region. This is a conflict that has existed for several decades and touches many, many people's lives in different ways. But where we got today, kind of setting the scene, I think many of your viewers and listeners and observers will have read the news and understood some of the more immediate details of what happened. But we, as observers of the region, understand that there have been many factors that have ignited the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on different fronts in different points of the past 10 to 15 years, escalating in different ways. But most immediately, as you mentioned, on October 7th, Hamas launched an attack where they breached the border from between Gaza and the Israeli territories and inflicted an assault that resulted in the killing of 1,200, about 1,200 or 1,300 Israelis so far. Um, this came as quite a shock to the international community, not just in terms of the horrific number of casualties, but also because of Hamas's ability to infiltrate, penetrate, and come under the radar of Israeli intelligence, which is one of the most well-known intelligence agencies around the world. What we're hearing now and seeing, of course, time will tell how Hamas was able to do that. Um, there's been talk about how Israel was focused in a number of ways on the West Bank, and it has been targeting Palestinians, that saying that there's been movement, especially in cities like Jenin. There's been organizing by Palestinian, different Palestinian militant groups, and they claim that they're preempting some of that. And so just in 2022 was the bloodiest year for Palestinians since 2004. So and just in 2023, this year, before this attack happened, you had also a very high number of Palestinians being killed, mostly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We saw in 2021 also an increase in another escalation in the aftermath of the tensions in East Jerusalem, where Palestinians were protesting Israeli policies that are aimed at evicting Palestinians from their homes, especially in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And especially in 2021, social media was a big factor in kind of bringing out the Palestinian voice to the rest of the world. So, from different perspectives, you could say that this was a surprise from Hamas only insofar as how much damage it was able to inflict on Israel. But in terms of escalations, these have happened over the past several years between Hamas and other militant groups and Israel. So where we are today is a very difficult situation where Israel's attacks on Gaza right now are inflicting incredible damage on Palestinian civilians. Of course, Israel is saying that it wants to root Hamas out of Gaza, and telling 1 million Palestinians to move from northern Gaza to the southern part is, as the international community has noted, is nearly impossible. In terms of its attempts to, stem the loss of civilian life. So we're at a very difficult place where Gaza has already been under siege for since 2007, when Hamas was elected by Gazans, and the majority of the international community, including Israel, of course, decided to impose a siege where a lot of the economic impact has been devastating for the Palestinians. So very little economic activity with the rest of the world that has made the lives of Palestinians in Gaza incredibly difficult. And we're faced with a situation right now where, because of how high the tensions are right now and the incredible loss of life, there may be other parties getting involved. You've had the U.S., of course, supporting Israel, but there are other parties, Hezbollah, maybe the Houthis in Yemen, that may get involved and expand this into a regional war, which is the fear right now.
Thanks for that overview. And I think it is a good segue into sort of another question I had, right? Because you follow this region, and I've sort of, on the Afghanistan side, followed sort of the logic of militant movements and terror organizations and how they tend to operate. Often the lay person who doesn't know much about how these orgs work does not think that there's a strategy behind the madness of using terrorism, but often there is. And I wanted to get a sense from you, right? In the run up to these terror attacks, if I sort of filter my Google, or the audience filters their Google, prior to this attack, there was engagement between Israel and Hamas. There were conversations about work permits and reducing the barriers at the border. But then this happens, right? From your point of view, I know it's still very early, but what is the broader strategic calculus under which Hamas is operating, right? Because there's also, in my view, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, a very simplistic view here that says Hamas is an Iranian proxy, and Iran did not want Israel-Saudi normalization to happen. So they basically did this, and this ends the process right now because everybody's inflamed. At a personal level, as a non-expert, find it quite simplistic as a take. So I was wondering if you could help the audience understand, in your view, from Hamas's point of view, what's the strategic calculus of doing this and unleashing so much devastation on Israeli citizens and then unleashing much more devastation on Palestinian citizens in Gaza?
Mm-hmm. I think, look, Hamas, first and foremost, I believe, is answering to the people that elected them in Gaza and more broadly the Palestinian populace that sees right now very little movement, very little representation for their cause, for their struggle. Um, I don't believe that Hamas, first and foremost, is getting instructions from Iran. It does get support. It does get support in many ways, economic, military. But Hamas's number one audience is are the Palestinian people, and for the people in Gaza who have been under siege for 17 years, there's very little to lose at this point. And Hamas is struggling economically to provide for 2 million Gazans. It's seeing the crackdown that has happened on the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It's seeing the incredibly extremist right-wing government that Netanyahu has put together, that has instigated and that has tightened the noose on Palestinians in many ways. And at this point, there's very little response that Hamas can provide that is not going to push the Palestinians even further into the abyss of the misery that they're in. So at this point, Hamas has little to lose. It may be that Israel's continued focus on the West Bank gave Hamas an opportunity to enter this conflict and attempt this, but I think we have to wait and see what is some of the dynamics that maybe have led to this that strengthened Hamas in a way that allowed this to happen. In terms of, we'll talk a little bit, I think, about the Saudi normalization potential, but I don't think that's the number one motivating factor.
Yeah, oh, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So again, sticking to the situation on the ground, right? Again, a lot of noise in conversation. So what I often do is, again, somebody who looks at economic data a lot, right, is to go search
Mm-hmm.
for data. So over the
Mm-hmm.
last week, for example, I've been looking at some in-depth surveys and polls of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza to understand how their views have evolved. And this is all pre-conflict data that was there. And one thing that stuck out to me was that increasingly over time, if you read some of these surveys, it turns out that more and more Palestinians, especially Palestinians in the West Bank, kind of say we will take a one state solution with equal rights, about 25% or 30% close to polling, right? Much more
Mm-hmm.
so than in Israel for the same
Mm-hmm.
question,
Of
for
course.
example. And then, of course, there's a lot of negativity around Israel for reasons that you just explained. But help us understand, like, how, from your point of view, in sort of the fallout of this conflict, as the days
Mm-hmm.
and months go by,
Mm-hmm.
what is likely to happen in terms of Palestinian views, particularly younger citizens' views about Israel, and also the United States, given the way in which the United States has sort of like stood by and basically
Mm-hmm.
given a free hand to Netanyahu's government to respond to Hamas's terror attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anyone in the Arab world is surprised about the U.S. position. I think the U.S. has defended Israel's policies in the West Bank and Gaza and supported Israel economically and militarily. Uh, how Palestinians will view, I mean, during these times where they're, they see people being killed, by Israeli warplanes and missiles, it's very hard to, I think if you would take the survey again, at this point, have anyone that, you know, identifies with anything other than majority will continue to push for independent Palestinian state. I think you see they recognize the realities on the ground are diminishing incredibly in terms of the ability to have a actual Palestinian state that is connected, that is contiguous because of the increase in settlements, because of the facts on the ground that are changing rapidly every single day, including by this extremist government. So while that may be the ultimate hope for most Palestinians to have an independent state, at this point they have generations of members of the same family whose grandparents have experienced the struggle and fathers and children. They may be willing to accept a one state solution where they're equal, with Israelis. For the majority of Israelis, that's not an acceptable solution. So, um, it's at a stalemate on that potential idea. But I think for most Palestinians during this height of Palestinian Israeli engagement and obviously attacks, it's they're going to call for whatever they feel, whichever entity pushes their right to exist, advocates for their freedom and kind of unshackling them from the Israeli occupation that impacts every single part of their lives on a daily basis, whether they're in the West Bank or in Gaza, where Israel withdrew its forces but continues to effectively have control over its borders, over access to the sea, and as you mentioned, like for example, work permits. Yes, Hamas has to work with Israel on those, and there are Palestinians that go into Israel proper to work, trying to address some of the economic challenges that Gazans face, of course. But this has also been used as a tool. So whenever there's in August, I believe Israel reduced the number of permits to when it accused Hamas of doing things in the West Bank. So this is again, if it's in the hands of Israel, it's going to be unreliable source of economic growth for the Palestinians.
On the sort of broader regional side, if we were to sort of zoom out into the region, what has been sort of what has stood out to you in terms of the response and reaction, right? Of course, in terms of when this first broke out, as I was monitoring it, I sort of, in my mind, drew a spectrum of saying, okay, sort of the United States is on one end over here in terms of standing with Israel, or the European Union. And then you had in the region, Qatar, for example, sort of being the most closely leaning towards Hamas and condemning Israel off the bat. UAE was
Mhm.
closer to the United States. Saudi was a bit closer to Qatar. And then you had Jordan, Egypt, sort of, you can draw a spectrum in the
Mhm.
middle. That's how I sort of read
Mhm.
these statements initially coming out. But then, of course,
Mhm.
things evolve. The situation is changing.
Mhm.
What has stood out to you in terms of the broader global and in particular regional response to this most recent wave of violence in Palestine and Israel?
Yeah, I think in the past you've seen the typical condemnations of some of the increased, whenever there's a big escalation. But right now, I think there was a recognition that this is different, that this is a new phase of the conflict, especially as you saw the turning point kind of with the attack on the hospital. And just the large number of deaths there and the gruesome scenes that came from there. I think as the casualty number of casualties in Gaza was rising, that was directly related to how the Arab Street was responding. Now you have countries like you mentioned, the UAE and Saudi Arabia that especially the UAE with its recent signing of the Abraham Accords, carefully worded condemnations, but secondary condemnations after the incredible rise in casualties in the Palestinians. The UAE also had to manage domestic concerns. While you won't see large mass protests like you have seen in the streets in Jordan and Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco, there's still a sense that people in the Arab world, even in the Gulf, are feel connected to the Palestinian cause and feel a sense of injustice has been inflicted on the Palestinians. Um, in terms of where this goes, I think it's very concerning for Jordan and Egypt. They have the largest borders with Israel. They are worried about potential refugee flows. They have publicly rejected the idea of having Palestinians displaced in their countries. Not necessarily because they don't want to deal with refugees. Jordan has one of the largest, numbers of refugees of Syrians, Iraqis, and of course Palestinians from decades ago. But there's a sense that if Palestinians in Gaza were to leave, it would be very hard for them to return, and that this would be another forced displacement of Palestinians like it was in 1948 and 1967. So each of these countries has to grapple with domestic concerns about how this issue affects them if they have large Palestinian population like in Jordan, but also what are the security concerns they have? The Gulf countries have concerns about Iran's backlash, and countries like Jordan and Egypt have security concerns of the actual conflict just pouring in to their borders. So each of them is trying to manage different challenges at this point.
Would it also be fair to say that perhaps, one of the bigger challenges here is that a lot of actors, particularly proxy actors in the region, are primed to sort of enter the fray if things, let's say, continue to go in a viciously downward spiral. In my sort of scenario planning, I would love your thoughts on sort of different scenarios that you're trying to game out here. Is that more casualties with the invasion into Gaza will charge everyone up more. Hezbollah already is exchanging regular fire on the Lebanese border. The Houthis yesterday fired some missiles that U.S. destroyers shot down. Iran is making some statements, but at the same time, MBS and the Iranian president had a phone call. They've never done that before, right? So they also, you see that they're at some leadership level recognize, let's not allow this to get out of hand. So what are some scenarios that you're watching or things that you're watching out for in terms of Hezbollah and Iraqi militias and what's going on in Syria and Yemen in terms of looking out and saying, okay, is this stabilizing at some level and there's hope for a ceasefire, or it goes the wrong way and all of a sudden we have regional actors entering the fray led by proxies as the beginning over here?
Look, there are a number of festering, unresolved conflicts in the region. You have failed states in Lebanon and Yemen. You have obviously the unresolved Syrian conflict. You have economic challenges post-COVID world in a number of these states. So yes, there are proxies that are waiting to take the opportunity, but these are also conflicts that have left to fester and left unaddressed. And a lot of people are saying that the U.S. is disengaging from the region, doesn't want to be engaged in direct conflict. But regional actors have to also assume responsibility for the fact that the state, like you mentioned, Hezbollah and the Houthis, both in failed states right now. These are the issues that needed to be addressed so that when a conflict like this emerges, you don't have actors that are engaging in activities that states would not engage in. So addressing some of these conflicts is really important. And that's why I've been personally critical of some of the approach of the Biden administration in prioritizing what it calls a regional integration agenda, where let's have these Abraham Accords, peace agreements, because they allow us to increase economic trade between these countries, but they don't address some of the most challenging issues in the region. That every time there's a flare up of in the Palestinian territories, every time there's a flare up in Iraq, or there's protests in Lebanon, for example, like a few years ago, then you have this renewed fear that Iran is going to play into many of these conflicts. We need to address these conflicts independently so that you don't give an opportunity for escalating crises in other parts of the world. People are, proxies are just jumping in to make a point and to, renew their existence, I guess you could say, on the world stage and their relevance.
Yeah, I would love more of your thoughts in my next question on sort of critiquing the Biden administration response and sort of the U.S.-China rivalry and how that plays out in the current context. But I remember at the UN this year, for example, right, when Bibi stood up and put out this map that did not even show Palestine. And I remember thinking in my mind that this is not going to end well, because here you have a leader of a right-wing government that has empowered settlers who have been occupying more and more Palestinian lands, now daring to go to the UN, showing a map that doesn't show a state of Palestine. it's going to inflame a lot of people. And then you
Mm-hmm.
gave the context of what had been happening in the region. And I saw it from my point of view as sort of a South Asia watcher, right? These things with states
Mm-hmm.
with a lot less proxy actors in the South Asian, Northern Himalayan region,
Mm-hmm.
with China, India, Pakistan, even the nine
Mm-hmm.
dot line or dash line in the straits
Mm-hmm.
in the east.
Mm-hmm.
States get very agitated when other states tend to do this stuff. So now just
Mm-hmm.
imagine what non-state actors who have used
Mm-hmm.
terrorism as the
Mm-hmm.
policy would
Mm-hmm.
react. And so this was, it was, I agree with you that the administration sort of, you can't wish these things away, the underlying problems in the
Mm-hmm.
region, and just move ahead with these agreements. So would
Mm-hmm.
love your thoughts on sort of first up, the critique or your point of view of the Biden administration's policy. Again, we know from reporting now a lot of dissonance at the State Department. Staffers
Mm-hmm.
from the Hill have written an anonymous letter, a very good, strongly worded letter, asking congressmen and women to push for a ceasefire. We've seen rallies in Dearborn. I
Mm-hmm.
think the line that stood out to me over there was from a Palestinian American activist who said in 2020, the Democrats came to us to save America from Trump. In 2024, we will save Palestinians from Biden. So there is
Mm-hmm.
a political angle here as well. So would
Mm-hmm.
love you more of your thoughts about what would you have liked the administration, or even now, what would you like them to do a bit differently at this point in time?
Look, I think it's hard. I think if the US disengages from the region or it engages from the region, it's going to be criticized. So um, there's no easy route. However, there are a number of issues where the U.S. has leverage, and where the Biden administration, in prioritizing some of these agreements between Israel and the Gulf countries, has downgraded some of the most pressing conflicts. What's happening in Lebanon is really disastrous. We saw, the Lebanese lira, plummet in the past couple of years, and there's a number of conflicts where the U.S. is just not interested in engaging on. It has leverage with Saudi Arabia and the UAE on Yemen. It has its own role in Yemen. These are conflicts that I do believe, if left unaddressed, are going to continue to contribute to the instability in the region. If you ask people in the region, they would want the US to stick with its you know purported support for human rights, for democratic values, of course. But since the Arab Spring, the U.S. has not been a supporter of some of these populations, as you've seen, a big drawback in any progress that was made, even in countries like Tunisia. And you haven't seen the U.S. really lean into that, because if the only way the US will engage in the region is militarily, then yes, people do not want necessarily to have that. But what you're seeing here and how it's reflected in audiences in the U.S. and Arab and Muslim and South Asian members of communities here in the U.S. who represent a significant voting bloc and who are increasingly involved in local and federal government agencies, not just them, but others who are coming out and saying the way we're approaching this issue, the fact that we're not even trying to call for a ceasefire is really unacceptable. The incredible loss of human life, and people are starting to recognize that U.S. policy can make a difference, has been able to, and at the same time, it's just not changing when it comes to this conflict. We understand there's a long history between the U.S. and Israel, and all the reasons for the support of Israel. But at the same time, to stand by and watch Israel, pummel Gaza this way, I think you're going to have a lot of people, especially in this day and age where they have access to much more information and much more on the ground reporting, that is just kind of hard to look away from, hard to watch and have those images beaming into our phones and not feel like we have a role to play as the U.S. We have a role to play to do no harm and to stem some of the killing and some of the devastation that's there. Going back to your initial question about Biden's engagement in the Middle East, I do think that much more emphasis has been put on the normalization agreements, with the hopes that if you get a few neighbors, a few people in the neighborhood to make peace, then eventually, that one house that's being targeted or in conflict is going to solve itself. But that's not the case. That hasn't been the case. The Abraham Accords were signed 3 years ago, but when Secretary Blinken went to the region immediately after October 7th, he wasn't reaching out immediately to the countries that were recently normalized. He was reaching out to Jordan and Egypt that have had 30, 40 years of peace agreements with Israel. But even those agreements, they've been, according to the populations of both of those countries, unpopular, but they do provide some leverage. The most immediate agreements are not ones that have been playing into this, and they haven't contributed to, for example, as you would say, the UAE argument that we'll have more leverage with Israel. In fact, the government has only become more emboldened, more extremist, more settlements growing, more statements coming from Netanyahu's ministers. Even one of them, you mentioned the map that Netanyahu put in the UN that doesn't include Palestine. Smotrich, who's one of his ministers and one of been called out as really a right wing extremist, included Jordan in one of the images that he had put of a map of Greater Israel. That really set people on fire in Jordan. So I don't think you can continue to have that kind of rhetoric and not have people in the Arab world, feel a sense of desperation and loss of hope and loss of faith in the U.S. role in the region.
Compared to the U.S. sort of point of the position, your points on the critique of the administration's policy, how do you then see China and its foreign policy in the region? Of course, with the last big story, a success story for the Chinese in the region was sort of like a thaw that they brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? A big sort of photo op moment. Even now, when I look at sort of, let's say, in the South Asian or East Asian region, India has walked a very tightrope condemning terrorism, but then insisting that it believes in a two-state solution as being the only path forward here. China has taken a similar point of view, and sometimes, at least in conversations I've had in DC, some people in the administration are not happy with that position. In fact, Chuck Schumer was in Beijing and apparently did not, and sort of said that he was unhappy with China's position. But China's towing its own line. And many friends of mine, at least when I talk to them in the region, and particularly in Jordan, say that, hey, the Chinese actually are on the right side here, and their standing is only going to grow as a result of their diplomacy or their public posturing here. So how do you assess the Chinese approach at this point in time?
Well, I think the Chinese are trying to use this opportunity in their favor. They're trying to curry favor with the Arab states by calling for a two-state solution. I believe that's their initial response, which angered Israeli audiences. And condemning the loss of life on both sides. It wants to cast the US in a bad light as being kind of a negative actor in the region, contributing to instability, not being an even-handed arbiter between the Israelis and Palestinians. And it's playing on the general mood in the Arab world and the global South more broadly, that is more sympathetic to the Palestinian struggle. So at this point, I think you'll see that as the U.S. has been disengaging a little bit from the region, China is playing an increased role. People will tell you, like, China doesn't tell us how to live. It doesn't tell us that we need to have democracy and then turn its back and then not support democracy. So people see it as an economic actor right now. And I think it's treading carefully, using this opportunity to appeal to some of the Arab voices that are calling for, more critical U.S. policy towards Israel. But at the same time, it's thinking long term. How is it going to play into a potential vacuum if the U.S. were to really step away more and more from the region. The way that it's looking right now, that's not going to happen in terms of the US stepping away. It's looking like it's going to be pulled back into the region, especially as we mentioned, if this conflict goes beyond the Israeli Palestinian borders.
Yeah, I think one of your global south point, I think, is a very important one. One of the most common questions to which I don't have an answer to is, friends from the global south asking, well, explain to me how one form of occupation in Crimea or Eastern Ukraine is bad, and another form of occupation does not even get a response as an occupation. It's not even called an occupation in
Mm-hmm,
public
mm-hmm,
pronouncements by the same administration or the same
mm-hmm,
people who will very
mm-hmm,
vociferously write about how terrible occupation in Europe
mm-hmm,
is. And I honestly don't have an answer to that. And I just say that's the hypocrisy of a great power, and all powers are hypocritical at some point, and we should call out that hypocrisy, right? That an occupation, whether it's in Eastern Europe or Eastern Asia or in Palestine, is an occupation. And let's start with that conversation and be a bit more
mm-hmm,
blunt about it. So I
mm-hmm,
appreciate you sharing your thoughts today, and explaining to our audiences what's going on and how you see things shaping up in the region. I always ask my guests before I let them go to give some reading recommendations. Most of the time, I say it's a topic of your
mm-hmm,
choosing, but I would appreciate, given how little
mm-hmm,
people know, but how emotionally charged they are about what's going on today, if you could give some reading recommendations to folks
mm-hmm.
who may want to dive a bit deeper into understanding this conflict and having a more nuanced view about what's going on.
Yeah, I would say, you know, there's going to be a number of versions of history of this conflict. And I think it's important to go to the voices that are indigenous and, you know, try to diversify the reading materials. The ones that I personally would recommend, there's the 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi, who is one of the foremost contemporary historians of the Palestinian struggle. And on a more personal account, there's I Saw Ramallah by Mourid Barghouti. This is a book that really captures some of the personal loss that Palestinians experienced over the course of this conflict, and you know, sometimes it helps to humanize the issues and understand that we're not just talking about headlines here and geopolitical movements. There are people that are struggling behind these headlines, and it's important to hear their stories.
Thank you for those recommendations. I will put them on my own list as well, because something I've been, your point on indigenous voices is super, super important, because I almost am done with this book titled The Dawn of Everything. And it gets into, redefining what you and I perhaps, and many of us read in political science and IR classes about the Renaissance and Clausewitz and
Mm-hmm,
all of that. And this book basically takes and flips everything on its head and says that a
mm-hmm,
lot of the Renaissance era conversation about what does it mean to be a free human being, etc., were actually
mm-hmm,
indigenous societies in North America and the New World that the French
mm-hmm,
and then the English were engaging with. And the indigenous voices were like, you guys are not free, you are so oppressive, and all of that. And that then fed into the European discourse.
mm-hmm,
And when you read that book, you realize that when you are only told history from a particular perspective, you see that as the only way events shaped up. And that book did a very good, job, at least at a personal level to me, of reminding me that there's a different part of this. And if we go a bit deeper, we realize that even the European experience with the Renaissance, one was happening in the backdrop of industrial enslavement of indigenous people, but two, the conversation with indigenous people and their ideas of liberty and freedom fed into the popular discourse of Europe at that time. And so, thank you for reiterating that point. I think that's a very important one. And thank you for your time. Thank you for
absolutely.
your analysis and the reading recommendations. And I think you and I both can agree on the fact that we need a ceasefire. We
Mm-hmm,
need humanitarian aid to flow into Palestine, in particular
mm-hmm,
Gaza. And
mm-hmm,
I think we need the United States to step up a bit more in terms of calling an ace at a moment like this, and pushing all actors in the region to stop what's going on at this point in time. So thank you, and appreciate you joining us today.